you folks know already, there is a new version of EML. It's version 2.2, and it came out about a month ago. And so today, I'm going to give you a short introduction to those changes, and but I'm going to leave most of the period for discussion and questions. So basically, whoops, so let's see here. So the first thing you have to know, and the bottom line, is EML 2.2 is backwards compatible. So that means the changes to 2.2 are all additions, and everything that you used in 2.1 still works in 2.2. And so if you want to, you can keep making 2.1, or you can relabel it as 2.2, and that'll be fine too. So EML 2.2 has some fairly significant additional structures. And anytime that happens, you're going to be wondering how this is going to help me and my data sets. You'll want to be aware of the benefits of these new structures, and if or how they might work for you. And you should know EDI is going through this as well. So data producers, most of you folks, will be most focused on what you need to do in order to make use of a new feature, with those potential benefits in mind. And EDI's role in this figure is mostly as the archive and portal for the data packages, which are your data. So we are also concerned with handling those new features. But we're data set producers too, so we have to think about the bottom part as well. I have to keep mine. And for each part of this process, a different aspect of a data management system will come into play. Here's just a couple. But everywhere, there's going to be choices to make and practices to define. So today, we're mostly talking about the middle box. What are the new structures in EML 2.2? I have a few examples of some activities that are already happening related to these, and that actually involve the whole chain. So here is a quick summary of the overall benefits of these new features in 2.2. Basically, that data are easier to search. And this is actually important to a group like LTER, because with thousands of data sets, it's getting difficult to distinguish them. And for example, these explicit funding codes are now available that can mean you can write targeted queries to specific parts of a data set. There's also some options for simpler, commonly used formats for some content instead of using structured XML elements. And overall, data sets in 2.2 can contain enough structured information that they can be evaluated the same way as data papers are. So they have fields designated for things like purpose and associated papers. And some of these were already in 2.1, those of you who know the schema. So with any new feature, these will take additional attention. And so not every feature is right for every data set. And communities like this one should plan to set their priorities and identify the most important or appropriate data sets, and especially if they're going to need specialized attention. So here is the quick overview of the new features. This is the 10,000-foot view. Basically, text types, text elements now have a choice of text type or GitHub style markdown. There are new elements for data papers. Taxonomic classification has a place to hold external identifiers, for example, from a taxonomic registry like ITIS. The project tree includes more background information, and this is where the structured funding description is. The unit dictionary has been improved. Now it's been expanded with units that are commonly used in groups like LTER and in the Arctic Data Center. Name strings were harmonized to align with LTER recommendations, and there's more I'll tell you about later. And finally, we have the capacity to add annotations to data sets with terms from external vocabularies that are more rigorous than you can do with simple keywords. So whoops, just to reiterate one more time, it's backwards compatible. So you can keep making EML the way you do now, or you can simply relabel it. And if you do choose to relabel it, this is pretty much all you need. You need a new root element. And this is what it would look like. It updates the namespace from EML 2.1 to 2.2. It also changes the namespace for the unit schema. That's STMML, because that's where the units changes are. And the schema location is updated. And this is what is used by your local system. For example, if you open the metadata record in the Oxygen editor, it'll look here for the schema to check your EML against. So let's jump in. The changes to text type mean that you can either use, oh, first of all, sorry, for some dataset builders, here's the overall benefit of adding this feature to text type, that for some dataset builders, Markdown will be easier to handle than the XML fields were. Because you can now use a GitHub flavored Markdown in place of the XML features. We added this because Markdown is now really common, for example, in code documentation, and the doc type that comes with the original EML is a little arcane for some and not as used as Markdown. So for some dataset builders, this will be easier to handle. And this is what it would look like. In 2.1, you had these standard, can I make a pointer? Okay, in EML 2.1, you had specific XML elements for different parts of something like an abstract. In EML 2.2, you can continue to use this 2.1 structure, or you can use a C intersection that's enclosed in Markdown tags. And this has Markdown header markers and paragraph separations instead of XML. So the citations of papers are important in a lot of data sets. I've been meaning citing papers within the data sets itself. And they're essential for things like data papers. So a group of new citation elements are now included. And for data papers, this means that the EML can be is now more highly structured to hold that than the text type that is typically used. I'm not sure why I have the word indented in there. I'm terribly sorry. I'll get rid of that. Here's a quick summary of the new element names and where you would use them. So let's see, where are we? So in EML 2.1, citations were included in only a couple of places under method step and project. Now, and I've grayed these out since have been around for quite a while. And now there's 3 more places where you can actually include citations. You can cite a paper where the data set was used, and that's this one up here called reference publication. Here's where you would cite a data set that was specifically, or the paper that the data set was specifically designed to go with. And if that data set has a list of citations of its own, you can put those in a list called literature cited. So these are the lists of articles that were referenced in that data set or its associated metadata. And then finally, there's a third new element called usage citation, which could hold other subsequent uses of a data set, for example, in meta-analyses. Now, using this element for all, this might be impractical in some cases because there are other external methods of linking data sets to papers. And the names and the uses of these elements were chosen to be parallel to other groups working with structured metadata like Dryad and the Code Meta project. And so this is what it would look like. Oops, excuse me, again, here's sorry, this is just a summary of the XPaths where you can use citation, and those are the citation XML elements. But you can describe a citation either as XML or as bibtext, and here's what the bibtext would look like. It simply has a bibtext element and then bibtext structured citation. Literature cited can either be a single citation or it can be a list. So as far as data papers in general, data papers are a specific type of data set, and they're not likely to be used for lots of time series or other basic data sets. I said not likely, but it's possible that you could. But you would see these new features, these new fields in the schema, so you want to be aware what they're for. There's several that are text type fields specifically intended for data papers. So those are over there on the left. There's one about the introduction, the synopsis, acknowledgements, and getting started. And then there's the additional citation type elements here that I already told you about. Next is taxonomic IDs. This is a feature that's been requested for a long time, or that's been in the list of things that we should add for a long time. And now we have it. It's a mechanism to create an external link, to an external registry for taxonomic coverage. And so this is a list of the kinds of taxonomic registries that we might use. There's IDIS, which holds lots of coverage, is very broad. USDA, the Catalog of Life. These are all things that actually could go into a taxonomic ID field. And here's, again, the difference between an EML 2.1 entry for taxonomic classification and the one for EML 2.2 that now has this new field, taxonomic ID. And I've put 2 in here. There's actually a bad practice in here, which I'll let one of you catch for me. It'll be corrected by the time these slides make it to the EDI final resting place, but right now it's I forgot to fix it. I've put in 2, one for the IDIS identifier and one for the NCBI identifier for this species. The project tree. So the project tree, how am I doing for time? I only want to talk for 20 to 30 minutes, and I think I'm doing pretty well. The project tree, so there's a new XML node here that will support finer grain queries for project information and support of that project. In EML 2.1, there is one section on funding with only a text field for how to describe the funding of that data set. And here's an example from our actual data set. In EML 2.2, you can be much more specific about this. And here's the 5 fields that are available. 2 of them are required if you use this one. They are, let's see, let me look at my notes here. The 2 that are required are the funder name and the award title. So the unit dictionary, the benefits of the changes to the unit dictionary are that the unit list itself, the dictionary, will be easier to peruse, and you can now convert units, values in units using the UD units tools. So the summary of the changes, several of the unit types were renamed just to better reflect the dimensions. The definitions of them have not changed. We added some units that were important in some of the domains that we have a good coverage in, particularly for oceanography, climatology, forestry, and limnology. And these came mainly from the LTER unit dictionary and the Arctic Data Center holdings. One of the frequent requests that we've seen is that unit naming was inconsistent and that we should improve that to make list of units itself easier to browse. So we took care of that using the spelling conventions that the LTER recommended. And what we did was to add the new consistently spelled unit, but mark the inconsistent form as deprecated in favor of the consistent one. So this means that EML can contain either one, and that's how you maintain the backward compatibility. But a pick list that is showing users a list of units can filter out the inconsistently spelled ones. And the last thing is about UD units. It's a C package for converting physical quantities. The package also has an R wrapper. So for units that were in the UD units list, we added a synonym for those so you can run unit conversions on data sets with EML units. And here's an example of how units were described in EML 2.1. Here's a unit bushel and the unit cubic inch. And here's the same 2 units as how they look now in 2.2. You see that bushel has a UD unit synonym, so you can look up bushel in that directory and do a conversion using its conversion. And for cubic inch, this is one that we deprecated in favor of the standard spelling inch cubed. So this is what the deprecated tag looks like. So next is annotations. This is a rather major one, but the benefit is that you can link to external vocabularies which themselves can be highly structured. And I'll show you a couple of examples here. In EML 2.1, datasets have keywords, but in 2.2, those keywords can be, those terms that are in keywords can be much more explicit, and they can include the identifier to a complex external vocabulary. So these are more powerful because the computer is able to follow that URI and understand more about that term and its relationships. The general rule would be that annotations should have URIs, not just URLs. So if you simply have a term, put it in a keyword. Whoops. Oh, Here's another example of an annotated attribute or a measurement. So the basic structure of the annotation is the same here as it was at the data set level. But the attribute level, the annotation points to a definition in a measurement dictionary. And it's just about that column of data. At the data set, it pointed to a general term that applied to the whole data set. So the Arctic Data Center was already asked by NSF, their funder, to annotate the data sets in its holding in order to improve searches. And so they've begun adding measurement annotations to hundreds of carbon cycling related data sets with thousands of attributes. And so for those of you who are with the Arctic LTER sites that replicate their data packages over to ADC, we should talk. Another example of how annotations of the pipeline of getting annotations into data sets is this core Metabase project. I think most of you are aware of this. This is an LTER project. And that relational model is already planning for how to incorporate annotations into a backend system, the core Metabase, and to get it into their EML records. They are focusing on two levels, the data set level and the attribute level. So those are the two examples that I showed you earlier. So what is my time? Oh, not bad, 20 minutes. I know I went through this fast, but this was an overview, and I want to stop here for discussion or questions or to review slides if you like. These are some questions that we have at EDI that we would like input from you folks on. First of all, we know we will need to update the EML best practices. So we would love your feedback on how that should be arranged or modernized. Second, EML would like to, or ADI would like to improve our users' ability to find the data sets they're after. So basically this means to improve search precision and recall. And there may be some features of EML 2.2 that will help with that. But regardless of whether we use the EML 2.2 features, improving search requires the use of consistent terms across data sets. And how can we encourage those? Advanced features would take additional attention. So we might need, as a community, some guidelines for how to classify data sets that are the best fit for certain features. And I want to stop there and stop sharing so you guys can ask questions or revisit slides. Is that okay?
Sounds good, Margaret.
Stop. Okay. Questions, comments? Rotten Tomatoes? John, you're going to say something.
I will ask. Well, just first of all, the unit stuff sounds good there. Have we ever gotten to the point where we can specify sort of what the object of a unit is? Remember the classical problem of it. Is it moles? Is it milligrams of nitrate, or is it grams of nitrogen? What's the object of the unit? And because for some conversions, it's not meaningful unless you have that.
So, so there's two parts to that question. One is conversions, and my understanding is that UD units, if you do a conversion with UD units, I'm pretty sure if you were to use something like moles in your unit, it might not be able to handle a conversion to grams unless you gave it enough additional information. But I'm not an expert on that package, so I'm not quite sure I'm answering.
Well, I can promise you that it cannot make that conversion without knowing what you're going to.
I think I tried it, and I think it tells you, like, well, you didn't give me enough stuff. But I don't exactly remember what that message looks like.
But I guess the question has always been, where in the, it doesn't have to be in the unit, but there needs to be a spot to specify what that object is. So and right now it's sort of like, well, put it in the documentation somewhere. Well, that's not really very satisfying.
So the best place for it to go is in another part of the measurement description. And the place that we have for EML, in EML 2.2 for that, is the annotation. We can dive into some of those things because I actually do have some examples, but I think that might be better done in like an office hours or at the end of this. Just
so long as that's clear in the best practice, just so long as there's a place where you can be specific.
There is, but annotations get complicated pretty fast, and keeping this at a high level it's a tightrope or a slack line, depending. neither one. There is not a super simple solution for that yet, but there is a solution. There's something in the chat. So yeah, so okay, so Tim and An say, let's migrate EML best practices to Markdown. I think that's a great idea, and I could use some volunteers. Especially if you're good at Markdown. One of the things that has occurred to me is that if we break it up into Markdown, we can have different people address subsections rather than having it be monolithic the way it is right now. So I think that actually might make it a little easier to bite off and volunteer. So you actually could volunteer for certain parts. Like, I want to work on data papers. I want to work on keyword terms or something like that. An and Tim, can you comment?
Yeah, everything you just said sounds great.
And are you volunteering? Is your hand up? I can't see your face.
Let's see, how do
Maybe.
I just start my video? Oh, there we are. Yeah, in fact, there may even already be a pull request in the best practices.
I think there probably is, yeah.
So that'd be a good starting point.
Okay, yeah.
Tim's been talking about this pull request for months.
Say again?
Tim's been talking about this pull request for months.
Oh, good. Then this is the time to get started on it.
As long as I've got the camera on me, I'll also say that you had a question about how we can encourage consistent use of units, for example. I think that if you, at the search portal interface, if you provide functionality that takes advantage of that, then that will encourage people to supply their information in a way that takes advantage of that functionality. So, for example, if you had, if you were tied into some kind of ontology with respect to what's being measured, well, somebody may have tagged their item, their data variable as phosphorus, but if a user is looking for something at a higher level, like just nutrient data in general, then a data set that was properly tagged would show up in that search. So enabling that functionality, I think, is the key to encouraging users to describe their data in that way.
And I like that idea, leading from the search interface at some level, but I think one thing that EDI would find really useful is which vocabularies are the most used to you. What we have seen to a certain extent is a lot of these vocabularies tend to focus on a particular domain. And that means that they aren't necessarily good for everything. And that's actually a rather major problem. But yeah, no, I like that idea. Although I also would want to avoid people coding their EML generation to a particular use, like the EDI portal. My own opinion is that the metadata should describe the data it holds as well as possible. And that it's possible that some search portals, that the search portals have to be able to adapt to those features as well. Because there are other portals where your data sets show up. And they may adopt different practices for how they want to run searches. So the terms that we use, we have to choose carefully in order to reflect the data holdings themselves.
Yeah, I can see that. And I would hope that the best practices would evolve first and would evolve around what's really best for describing the data and not what's best just to take advantage of whatever fancy thing a given data portal is using.
Mm-hmm.
Best practices first about the data, and then the data portals can pick up either on the best practices or on the many data sets that start using those best practices.
Right.
And create that functionality.
Who else? Do we have people? Oh, go ahead, Corinna, sorry.
Yeah, so Tim, when you say that, I think the next question then is, how would you feel about us adding keywords to your data set so that it would fit to the EDI search or optimize the EDI search? So you being responsible for describing the data, us being responsible for making the search interface work well.
When I hear about a data portal messing with my data, I feel violated initially. But it's
See?
a very brief sense of violation, because then really what's happening is you're doing that work that I think makes my data set better, and you're doing it for me. So I think I would be on board. It might be good if it wasn't a one-sided effort, that there was communication when this was happening.
So this is, just to put it, when I mentioned the Arctic data centers annotations, they actually have full control over all the metadata that they hold, except for the data that comes in from the LTER sites. So that's why I need, and you're one of them. So that's kind of one of the things we have to talk about is how can you make your data available to their fancy search interfaces but still maintain control at your end? If that's the model that you want to continue with. The other thing you could do is give them control of your IDs, but I think things would get messy really fast if you did that. But that's another discussion. I'm trying to keep track of these other discussions. One is the one John brought up with the materials and other aspects of measurements besides the units, and this is a more of a process one. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, yeah, Corinna, full speed ahead, but I would like you to use annotations to label the things that you have done versus the things that I have done, so that if a question does come up, we can, if somebody comes into me and says, why did you label it with this keyword? I can say, well, no, that was something that was done somewhere else. And similarly, if somebody comes to EDI and says, EDI, how could you possibly have done this? You can say, I didn't do it, that's John's fault. So, as long as it's sort of clear what part of the metadata is being, has been acted on by a particular person, as long as there's sort of an audit trail there, I think that really opens up a lot of changes that you could potentially make.
Thank you for calling it audit trail and not finger pointing, but yes. And here's a question from Gastel. Is EDI offering to suggest dataset level annotations for LTR sites datasets? If so, what format will the info be sent? As a CSV, Gastel, why don't you just ask this instead of me reading this? Oh, I don't see her. Oh, there she is.
I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know what Stephen Chong did for the Arctic data center data sets about carbon, where he suggested for them, I think even attribute level annotation as well as data set level annotation. And it looks really useful, and it's helpful to have someone familiar with the ontology to point at specific annotations, and of course, maybe ask the dataset owners if they have questions. If we haven't adequately described our attributes to be annotated, but such suggestions I think would be really helpful, but I would want to be able to anticipate in what format we'll be receiving such suggestions so that we can make sure our IM systems are able to incorporate those annotations into our EML. I wouldn't want like PASTA to post hoc change our EML and throw annotations in there, because then I wouldn't become part of the revisions and I wouldn't have part of my local system. But is this something EDI is considering offering?
So we're doing a very exploratory kind of project right now with a grad student here, computer science grad student, which has started 2 weeks ago. So I probably shouldn't even mention it because I have no idea where it's going. But the idea being that he would read in just about all the readable English text from all the metadata files, put them through some sort of text analysis, and then cluster them into groups and come up with concepts that they have in common. And then hopefully linking that to some sort of ontology. And I don't want to be more specific than that because we really haven't figured it out. So there are several of these services out there that suggest keywords. I think at one point in time, we even had one of those, right, Mark? I think Dwayne coded one where you could put an abstract in and then it would suggest words.
The hive.
The hive, yes. So all of these things are out there, and the discussion really is more on how you all feel about us messing around with what you guys are doing, really. Not so much how we're doing it.
I think Anna and Tim's chat suggestion about making sure that the things migrate back is also sort of an important one.
This is Suzanne. I think this is an interesting suggestion, and I think it sounds good, and I agree that it needs to migrate back somehow, but it also is not really a question for the IMs. It's a question for the researchers, because it's their data sets that are going to be affected.
Can I ask a question in general? Then this is, we actually had this conversation just recently in EDI. When you add keywords to, this is for LTERIMs or anybody who makes data sets for someone else, when you add keywords, and this could also apply to something like an annotation, does the data manager usually choose, or do you let the researcher choose? And if so, how do they make that choice?
I actually did a survey on this not too long ago.
Oh.
And basically what it is typically it is either and this is talking about using keywords in the controlled vocabulary, either the investigator submits a set of keywords and then those may be altered to match up with the preferred terms, or the information manager will just look at the data set and figure out what keywords apply to it. In other words, the researcher may not be providing that anyway. And I can actually give you the stats on it. It's in that paper.
I was going to say, is it in that paper? Which I'm trying to remember all the details in there.
Yes, there's a table, I think, that
Okay.
has that.
Okay.
So we do provide the LTR vocabulary list for our researchers to select from.
But the responsibility is theirs to choose the terms?
Well, certainly. It's their responsibility to document their data set. So yes. But if they don't, then I begrudgingly go and select some top level words.
So I guess the reason for asking this is that if we were to say, please pick a term off of this list, would it be the data managers on the data manager's desk? Would probably, well, it probably would be on your desk to be sure that that term was checked or that was included or something was there. Because if we do come up with, as Tim suggested early on, a general search interface that has a predetermined set of terms, we wouldn't want data sets to fall through the cracks. We would want to have some way of ensuring that that everything that needed to be tagged with one of these terms actually was. Now, that's something that when Corinna talks about EDI adding metadata, that would be one of the reasons we would want to take on that. But it's also something that we could, that you guys, if you want to have, you have primary responsibility, that falls on you instead. But that's an additional, that's an ask.
Are you talking about words outside of the LTR vocabulary?
We don't, maybe. I'm not sure of the coverage of that particular vocabulary right now. And there are other vocabularies as well, I mean, in the world, besides the LTR one in there. I know of projects trying to harmonize these, to cross-link between them. There's quite a few, well, not quite a few. There's a few people doing it for the vocabularies that have the ability to cross-link. John.
Just going to say, a lot of it also has to do with sort of the intelligence of the search system. And that's one of the issues is that, on the advanced search on the EDI page, you can do things like you can say, find me a data set that has this term in it or any of the narrower terms. So if you are searching on tree, well, if somebody just labeled things branches and leaves, if you have identified those as being parts of trees, then it would find those data sets as well. But the thing is that many search interfaces are not that sophisticated. They just see tree, they stop at tree. One way to get around that is to make it so that you do have sort of the whole hierarchy associated with a term actually included as, if not sort of a primary keyword, at least as a secondary keyword that's searchable. I don't think we necessarily want to fill the, completely populate, make it so that every data set has 100 keywords, but you can make it so that you've essentially sort of preloaded that stuff, so even a really simple-minded search interface can find it.
So that's actually part of the architecture that the Arctic Data Center is using now for measurements, where they have a vocabulary, an ontology that depending what measurement you tag the data set with in the dataset metadata, it will take the parent, it takes the lower level terms for that term and it puts them in the solar index, so that when you search on, say, carbon flux, you get everything below it as well. But that's the mechanism and that they've chosen to do that with. And it depends on having a hierarchical vocabulary that's designed, that's really precise. And that's some of the problems that I think we have sometimes with the LTER one. We tend to get more false hits because when you start to go down trees.
Well, part of it also is that there are some sort of practice issues in terms of the way people are using the controlled vocabulary, because I typically think of it as you put in the most specific term, and then that's then recognized by sort of the things above it. But what many people have done is put in all the things above it down to the more specific term. And that tends to sort of then overload some searches or whatever. But the thing is, it's what works when you have a dumb search engine.
Right.
As compared to a sophisticated one. If you have a sophisticated one, then all you ever want to put in is the most precise term.
I've seen, and I think even the GCMD vocabulary recommended you do that. Put in the entire tree of the last term.
That's what they tend to do. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that I think that's something that is really open to automation. I mean, if you can pick whatever, just as long as it has a hierarchy associated with it, you can pick whatever you want and use it to populate the list more. But anyway, those are some interesting things that need to be discussed in some detail.
And so having the input of this crowd is great, because that's the kind of decision that EDI has to make. And you said it, John, having a good hierarchy. I forget your exact words. I'm going to have to go back and listen to the recording. Picking that hierarchy matters. And that's one of the things that would be very useful. I mean, we have a semantics working group, because now we're talking about semantics now. And that would be one of the things we would want them to actually help us do. I think before EML 2.2 came out, there was not a lot of movement in that group, but I think maybe now this can we can reinvigorate that group a little bit. You're on it.
Yeah, well, and one of the things also when it comes to the sort of using it for searching and things like that, keep in mind that there needs to be sort of a ratio between the number of keywords that you're using and the number of data sets that you have, because the old uncontrolled vocabulary was pretty simple. Each keyword referred to one data set. So if you searched on a particular keyword, it was very specific. It found the one data set. but once we started having keywords that are used, well, anyway, there's that balance between the keywording problem gets harder and harder the more potential keywords that you have. In other words, the larger the vocabulary you're drawing from, the more difficult it is to assign terms to any particular data set.
But that's where using something that's highly structured like an annotation can help, because it would know that if I pull the slides up, something like a forest biome, it knows where, and the same way with the LTR vocabulary. If the LTR vocabulary structure was easily accessible from a search interface, which it is to some extent, but not as much as some other kinds of vocabularies.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking in terms of, you know, the question is that if you want to say, do you want to have a term that's forest, in which you can apply to forest data sets, or do you want to have separate terms for 650 kinds of forest, where often the distinction is relatively subtle, and one person will say, well, this is a mixed hardwood forest, no, this is a bottomland forest, no, this is a gallery forest. Those are all things that may be sort of a little blurrier in terms of the, or overlapping in terms of their definitions. And if you, that's why I tend to be concerned of, we just don't simply want to go grab Webster's dictionary and say, here's our controlled vocabulary, because that's essentially an uncontrolled vocabulary. Anyway, I'll get to it. It's a knotty issue.
What about other parts of EML 2.2? Things like one of the topics that's actually come up is funding codes. I think actually the two funding elements are, well, excuse me, the original funding element and the one for the structured awards are side by side. So are people likely to think about how to use the structured funding search anytime soon, or do you just want to? You think you're going to stick with the simple text description?
I like the idea of using the structured approach. I was surprised to see award next to funding instead of beneath, and a child of funding.
I think it is. I can pull that slide up and just go back to screen share.
I'm presuming you did it as a sibling so that you wouldn't break anything with.
Yes, I see what you mean.
Yes,
Yeah.
they are parallel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, just like intellectual rights and license are now parallel.
Yes, they're parallel because that's the simplest way to do the backwards compatibility.
Okay, but I don't know. Conceptually, to me, the award falls under funding. We all, from a conceptual standpoint,
Yes.
Ignoring backwards compatibility, how do you think about funding versus award?
I agree with you that funding that it could have been put underneath, but that would have broken backward compatibility.
All right.
Because funding is a text type.
So we can do it for 3.0 then, right?
Well, 3.0 is probably going to be backward incompatible, but that's a decade from now. I'm not going to worry about that yet.
Which is why we can do it for 3.0. We can break things.
You can break things, yes. Put that in as a comment to EML. Matt will love it.
Margaret, I just want to say that, I mean, I think maybe some people have already tested and played with some of the elements, and I think it'll take each site, just some playing around to see how it'll work. And I believe that you are going to be talking at the next virtual water cooler. Is that true? Has that been confirmed?
I did hear that rumor from Jason. Well, Jason asked me if that would work, and I said, yeah. I think you're right.
21st?
I think it's the 14th. I think it's next week.
Okay, because the 14th was a holiday, and so we were thinking about trying to move it to the 21st.
So either one is fine.
Okay, but I'm thinking that this is a good, from now to then, maybe a good opportunity for us to sort of absorb what you've told us and kind of play with it, and then at that virtual water cooler be able to come back with some more specific kind of questions. And
certainly. The other opportunity is that EDI has office hours. we have office hours on Wednesday. I think it's noon Pacific time. I have to ask. Colin's always there, but the rest of us are on call. So that's a great place to ask totally ad hoc questions. It's scheduled. It's every week, an unscheduled time. So
it's noon Pacific time, Margaret. 3
you.
Eastern and 2, I believe. Yeah.
And if that doesn't
CT.
if that doesn't work, then Slack me and we'll come up with something else. So any of these specific sections that you want to see the slides of again? I know I went through them really fast. The slides will be online pretty quickly. Well, certainly by the end of the week. I have to fix one thing I noticed. But other than that, they'll be online. And this was, Suzanne said this is recorded. So, and I think I grabbed the comments from the chat window and put them somewhere.
Yeah, Margaret, so you were talking about taxonomic IDs. You mentioned there was a mistake.
Yeah, did you figure it out?
No, I didn't.
Okay, then I'm going to fix it for you at a chance.
So what was it?
What, should I open the slide up again? No, I was gonna, you had your chance. The identifier is supposed to be a URI, and I just used a bare string for one of the identifiers. It's an old example, and I just realized I hadn't gone back and fixed it. Here, I'll show you the slide.
So Margaret, I did, as you pull up the slide, I did have a question about those taxonomic IDs, but I figured I'd just kind of wait till I played with it. But you listed a whole bunch of different ones, and you know, we typically keep track of the IDIS ID. But so each of those taxonomic, whatever you call them.
Identifiers? How about identifier?
Well, no, the groupings, like IDIS and USDA and Catalog of Life, they each have their own sort of connection to some sort of, for that taxon ID, is it obvious what you would use? Like I'm trying to think about what USDA plants is, because they just sort of, I'm not sure that they have a code, an ID.
So this is going to be a little interesting, and this is on my list to figure out. So the first things, as far as EDI supporting EML 2.2 features, the phase 1 plan is to add to the XSL template so that things like these new labels like this, I've got the taxonomic classification slide showing now. So here's my mistake. Where I wrote the string IDIS, it should be idis.gov. Now, the tricky part about turning these, and these labels actually could be turned into URLs, so that you would have a label that said, I don't know, Macrocystis pyrifera at NBII, and it would point to a web display of 35122 at NBII. It would actually be a link. I haven't figured out quite how to do that yet, how to construct a working URL from what's in this provider field. For some other fields, it'll be much more straightforward, but it may be that not every taxonomic provider actually has a landing page that they can figure out what the URL would be.
Yeah, I think it's different. It could be potentially different for each provider.
It could be a hideous, ugly XSL template, and I'm not sure how well it'll.
I feel like what you need here in this taxon ID element is, it's good to have something about who the provider is.
Yeah.
It'd be good to have, ideally, each taxonomic identifier would have its own URL that describes itself, like an ontology, right?
So this is supposed to be a URI. So a URI is a URL is a type of URI, but a URI, it has machine readability, and a URI very often goes to an endpoint that is a web page, but it also has computer readability. So your system is just to be smart enough to be able to use that external systems API, and then your web display might just point to the to the URI, which actually will resolve to the landing page. The place to go look for this, you can see it in action, is at the ADC. Let me go back. Let me find a couple more, down a couple slides. If you go to, here it is. No, ADC, So this is Arctic Center, arcticdatacenter.io, and look down here under this annotation, and you see this entry, type in carbon flux, because I know there's lots of carbon flux measurements. You'll see this definition is actually coming from a widget that goes and reads the API of the definition of carbon flux and puts it there on the screen. And then when you land on a data set that's annotated with this, it has a URL to go to that carbon flux measurement in another spot. But you guys can explore that on your own. You can also see how complicated it is to actually create widgets for, sorry, what I'm trying to say, these drop-down menus for measurements within an ontology. Looking at the high-level stuff is sometimes a little bit off-putting. But if you start with a search for something that you're pretty sure is going to be there, like carbon, you'll get a lot of, you'll see a lot of data sets that are annotated with these. So it's a good place to see how these kinds of features can actually be used.
But to take advantage of that functionality for a taxonomic identifier, you would need to be able to take that identifier and know how to get back information from that provider. So that's why I'm suggesting it'd be ideal if instead of just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for an IDIS taxonomic ID, you actually had the full URL where that identifier is described.
I think the reason for having it as simple as possible is that the provider, which I lost the provider. The provider should tell the portal how to build a URL. The portal has to know how to build a URL from this thing that's a provider.
For humans, the providers typically do, but for software, I don't know that that's done.
So, right. So yeah, but for the portal, it would be for human reader, because this is going to HTML at the moment. Because we're just talking about labels for HTML. John, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, yeah, this is a tricky one, because in one sense, what you want to have is something that does identify sort of what the provider is, but isn't necessarily a web route to the particular concept, because to tell you the truth, they change those all the time.
Yeah.
You don't want to go back and redo all your metadata because that's shifted. But at the same time, it's also important that you be able to say, okay, yes, this is IDIS, because it's not hard to write code that says, okay, it's in IDIS and here's the identifier. Go and get that, go find it in that place. I don't know. And the other thing is also you would like to have at least something that's human readable. So I would like, it would be nice if provider had, provider URL or provider URI and provider text, provider name, something where you can write down what it is. Because I promise you that if, the PIs are searching for something and they see the taxonomy and they see just a URL and a number next to it, they're going to be very confused.
No, I don't want them to see that. No, I want them to see a label or a usable label. But your comment about URLs versus URI is important because, yes, URLs change. URIs are not supposed to change the same way that DOIs don't change. DOIs are a type of URI. So once one is established, there has to be some kind of a sense of responsibility. And to be honest, I'm not quite sure that what I put in here for a provider for the NCBI vocabulary is right. I did the best I could coming up with how do I identify this vocabulary in a URI sense, but I'm not sure that it still works. I have to go back and see.
Yeah.
And if you go, the interesting thing about the word IDIS, Google it. It's not a good thing to use as a simple bare string the way I did here, because it means a whole lot of different things.
Yeah, integrated taxonomic information system.
Well, that's, yeah, so what I really, you know what? we need a much better string here than simply the 4 letters IDIS. That's not adequate because it doesn't identify that thing. So, anyway, that's enough on that, I think, unless it's enough from me.
I mean, one of the ways to deal with that also is in terms of practices. Is, you know, it isn't like there's 1,000 different providers out there. This is one of those things of where you could more or less list them all on one page and give an identifier that you should use for a particular one.
So that would be a really helpful thing to have in the best practice, because, and I don't know all the taxonomic registries that are out there, and which ones are going to be easy for EDI to support and a portal, and which ones are going to be hard.
A suggested place to look is check out the documentation for the tax size package in R.
Okay.
It's not comprehensive, but it's pretty darn good.
So if we were to say support those providers initially,
Right.
the ones that have URIs we can rely on to build URLs out of, that would be great. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if we, you know, just whether those have URIs or whether we create our own, you know, page that says this is what this refers to.
So one thing to keep in mind is that this field in EML is designated as being a URI. The schema does not check that, but you could imagine some external checker at some point being able to flag that and say, IDIS, that's not a URI. So the idea of making up our own might not be, we just have to keep in mind that there might be some repercussions to that.
I'm not sure I like this idea of making our own IDs for anything.
No, I don't either.
Because as long as it's a URL, as it is right now, we can do wholesale changes if it does.
But that's not what he said. I think he meant our own strings for identifying things, taxonomic registries that didn't have decent URIs of their own. I think that's what he was saying.
Yes, I think that's what I'm saying too.
Oh, okay.
So I don't think it's a good idea to come up with our own identifiers. I think our own identifiers should be the current URL as it is for these, because if we ever want to access them, then that's the only way to do it right now, unless there is any kind of other like ROR or whatever that will come up with these IDs and we'll manage them. Until then, I think we better go with URLs.
The thing would be to stick with sort of higher level URLs in the sense of pointing to the organization and not trying to drill down to the particular term. Because every time you throw another slash in there, it becomes less and less likely it's going to work in the future.
And I think that's why because NCBI does things other than taxonomy. I added that slash on this one, but I don't know that that's even safe. That might be something that belongs better somewhere else. Okay, I just noticed the time. It's the end of the hour. So people are going to start dropping off. Like I said, office hours, water cooler at the LTER in a couple of weeks, or Slack anytime. Well, more or less anytime. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.